Hey everyone, I'm Ryan,
And I'm Olivia.
and welcome to our 10th episode of Finding True North. We have hit double digits. Finding True North is about sharing the pivotal lessons and moments that can help you shape and navigate your career, and each week we are joined by a new guest. Olivia, who are we joined by this week?
Well, this week we're joined by my university friend Sophie. We met through a series of sustainability events. I was a student journalist covering a sustainability workshop at university, and Sophie was there with another friend, and I had to interview them for an article. We soon became friends as a result of that, meeting up for lunch and so forth. And even though we left university, we've become close ever since. The reason why we started Finding True North is because we're in the pandemic. We have lack of access to career education and career motivation. And so this web series can be your virtual resource to finding that information. Because of course, it's very important in life to know that when we navigate and route our careers, we can be inspired by other people, even though our own routes are unique. So Ryan is going to tell you how you can ask Sophie a live question in this episode.
Yeah, so there are a couple ways you can do that. So first, you can do it by using the comments box below on whatever platform you're watching. And it also will use slido.com. So later on, we've got a poll and the Q&A, and we'll give you the code of how you can participate on slido.com. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Sophie. I think it's very interesting to have someone from a very different background, actually, as an innovation manager for Humanitarian Innovation Fund. A lot of buzzwords there. So I'm really interested to hear more about what you do. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Olivia. And yeah, nice to reminisce a little bit about how we met. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of buzzwords in my job title and in my organisation's name. So I hope I'm going to dispel some of the myths around those buzzwords in this talk. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sophie van Eetvelt. And yes, I'm an innovation manager at Elrha's Humanitarian Innovation Fund, which we also call the HIF. So you'll hear me call it the HIF throughout this talk. So I'm going to dive straight in with a bit of a timeline of, I guess, what you would call my career to date. And hopefully that will just give you a bit of insight into who I am and my background, and yeah, maybe inspire you to ask me any questions towards the end of this. So we'll go way back when to 2008 to start with, where I took A-levels. And I think my A-levels are actually still really representative of who I am and how I approach the world of work and my career, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was really interested in a lot of subjects, and so I decided to do A-levels in biology and chemistry, but then also in music and Spanish. And I really loved that variety. I felt like it wasn't closing any doors to me, and it's definitely like shaped my career since, I think. So after A-levels, was in a similar boat, really didn't know what to do, didn't know if I wanted to go to university. My parents didn't go to university, and I'm the oldest in my family, so I didn't have any role models that had been to university. So it was a bit of a myth for me. I didn't really know what it actually meant to go to university. So I think because of that, I just ended up reading a lot of university prospectuses online and kind of just immersing myself in what the possibilities were. And much like with my A-levels, I was really interested in lots and lots of courses. So there's a lot of uncertainties. But then I read about a course that was looking at the effects of climate change and disasters around the world. And something in me kind of sparked, and I was like, oh, I think I'm onto something. And so I kept reading a little bit more about similar courses. And I found out about a course called environmental science. And so that's what I ultimately ended up studying, and I started in 2010 at the University of Southampton. And I'd say environmental science, it's becoming more and more popular, I think, but it's not exactly a traditional subject. And it really combines lots of different things. So it combines earth sciences and physical sciences with social sciences, geography, politics, demographics, law, conservation, biology. It's really, really interesting and really varied. So that's why I liked it. I also, throughout all my time at university, I think I was quite conscious that I didn't want to just spend all my time studying. And so I was lucky enough, I did a few kind of work placements, and I also had a number of part-time jobs just to earn some money on the side, and that was everything from working in Decathlon to working at the university doing working at open days and helping people move in on their first day at university and things like that. And then I also, through sheer kind of emailing and an opportunistic approach, I managed to get kind of 2 to 4 week work placements at different places where I just kind of went along and I suppose volunteered my time, but got to shadow some really, really interesting people. One of those places was Oil Spill Response in Southampton, which I learned a lot from, but other places like Winchester Science Centre and also the Environment Agency. And I think that really helped me feel quite balanced, like I wasn't just writing essays and attending lectures, I was also kind of getting practical experience. So moving on swiftly in my timeline. So I graduated in 2014. So I did 4 years at university, and that's because at some point in I said, actually, I think I want to do a 4-year course and get a master's, which was a really good option at the University of Southampton at that time. So I graduated, and like I said, you would hear this being said a lot from me, I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I decided to spend 3 weeks interrailing in Eastern Europe, which was really, really fun and really necessary when you graduate. I think if I'd gone straight into working or whatever, I would have been really, really exhausted. So yeah, Olivia told me to definitely mention going on holiday, and I really recommend doing that. And then, yeah, kind of not really finding something that I definitely wanted to do and having a few kind of dead ends. So I'd applied to graduate schemes that are really, really competitive, and I didn't get any of them. I'd applied to multiple jobs and maybe heard back, but then nothing happened. And so I was feeling a bit kind of like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do here. And so I decided to explore volunteering and internship. And in my mind, it was only going to be really short term. I knew I needed to earn some money, so I couldn't do it long term. And I volunteered at Fauna Flora International. And they actually paid for my travel and expenses during the day, so that was great. And then I volunteered locally with the South Downs National Park Authority and things like that. And I think it was as much as just to keep me busy and keep me kind of active and learning as it was to actually get practical experience. And it was beneficial for both those reasons. I also then worked in a call centre. And that was really, really important for me because it was hard work, it was long hours, and it made me realise that although I need a job to earn money, long term, I can't do something that I really don't care about and I'm not passionate about. It's just not sustainable for me. So that was really, really a really valuable life lesson. Then at the start of 2015, I guess I caught a lucky break. I came across a job for a role called an executive assistant at an organisation called the Natural Capital Coalition. I didn't know what an executive assistant was, but I went for it and yeah, I was lucky enough to get the job. And for me, that was really my entry to the world of work. And it was definitely a thrown in at the deep end kind of job. There was lots to do. I worked with really, really senior people at really big organisations, really varied tasks. It was pretty overwhelming, but yeah, definitely a valuable experience. And then after a few months there, I got to the point of realising in a similar way with the call centre, though I really like the organisation, this actual role that I'm doing isn't, it's not really driving me in terms of passion. So I started looking for some other jobs. And in 2015, later in the year, I moved to the Department of International Development, where after a year-long graduate position, I then became a partnerships manager. So the Department for International Development is a government department in the UK, and it's responsible for spending our foreign aid budget. And I joined a team working on climate, energy, and water, and mainly looking at research, but also innovation. And so that for me then, I think, got me interested in the concept of innovation, trying new things, trying things differently, moving away from the status quo. And eventually in 2019, after wanting to try something a bit new, I applied for a job at the Elrha Humanitarian Innovation Fund, the HIF, and became an innovation manager there. So I've been there now for about a year and a half. So key values I use to navigate my career. I actually found this quite hard, but it was really interesting to kind of reflect on what these values are for me. The first one for me is definitely humility, which means to me listening to others and welcoming guidance, particularly where I'm unsure. not being afraid to ask for help, and not being afraid to say, I don't know, actually, I need a bit more time, or can you help me with that? Yeah, I think I've grown a lot and learned a lot from having that mindset. So yeah, and I definitely still hold that with me. The second is curiosity, which is really, really, really important to me. And I think actually when I've been for interviews at organisations, I'm also looking out for an organisation that has that curiousness itself, that wants to learn, wants to be interested in different sectors, different applications of technology or innovation or whatever it is. And I think that means that if you have that curiosity mindset, you can pretty much learn from everything that you read and come across, or people you meet. And so it's really, really beneficial. The third value for me is what I've called space. And I think I got into quite a good habit with this at university, making sure that I had work time and then I had time for rest and socializing and kind of, I guess, the rest of my life. I think there's a really big culture of overworking and working long hours. And for me, that's not sustainable and it's not healthy. So I've made sure that I'm really clear where my boundaries are between work and rest, and recognizing sometimes you might need to work late, but for me, it definitely shouldn't be the norm. And then my last value is a bit of a cheating value because I called it flexible. And what that really means to me is that I want to be open to other values and learning as I go and adopting kind of new perspectives and approaches to doing things. And a really good example of that is with my role currently at the HIF. I lead our focus area on the inclusion of people with disabilities and older people in humanitarian response. Older people, people with disabilities are often excluded from response activities, or there are barriers that mean they can't participate. And it's really opened my eyes to how important inclusion is. And so for me, that's the kind of value that I should be open to and kind of bring on board as well. And so I think that's a good example of staying flexible to taking on new values. So this slide is about a kind of pivotal moment or something that you've come across that I guess changes your perspective on your career or something like that. I think this pivotal moment for me, I've chosen a quote which is from Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark. And the quote is, "Perfection is a stick with which to beat the possible." And I think though it wasn't like a pivotal moment in that I suddenly realised that I felt like this, it was more that reading it in the book recently just made me realise how much that was something I believe in and kind of have done for a long time. So I think for me, what this means in practice is that if you strive for absolute perfection in everything you do, you're probably going to take a really, really long time to get stuff done. And also that the world is really, really fast paced. And if you achieve something that might be considered perfect this month, maybe by the end of the year, it won't be considered perfect, or next year. So I think it's a bit of a kind of efficiency thing, even to not be hung up on being perfect, to do your best, to be conscientious and to learn from your mistakes and kind of move forward and keep building progress, even if it's not absolutely 100% perfect. And I think that really that quote really resonates with me. So now I'm quickly going to hand over to Ryan, who I think is going to explain how you can participate in this poll.
Yeah, so to participate in the poll, you need to go to slido.com and use the code FTN, which stands for Finding True North. And the question here, which I love this question, by the way, I'm really interested to hear people's responses. So what do you think is the main cause of humanitarian crises around the world? And you've got 4 options there. What we'll do is we will come back to the results of this poll at the end during the Q&A. So again, slido.com is how you take part, and I'll pass it back over to you, Sophie.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So fittingly after that poll, I thought maybe something that I can use this Finding True North kind of live cast for productively would be to just share a really rapid overview of what the humanitarian system is. I didn't know much about it until I started working at the Department for International Development, until I started, especially now, working at the HIF. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't know that much about because it's a huge, huge system. A lot of money goes into it. And we hear in the news all the time about different crises around the world. So I think it's something that hopefully you'll find interesting just learning about. But I do want to give the caveat that every humanitarian response in a different context can be different, and it's very, very complex often. So what I'm doing here is just giving a really kind of generic and high-level summary. But if you're interested, then please, read more. There's loads of stuff online that can help you learn a bit more about what it looks like in a specific country, for example. So the first thing is that the concept of humanitarian aid is not new. It's been practiced for a long time, but it was in the 1990s, so kind of around 30 years ago now, that things started becoming more formalized with a kind of recognized way of working around international humanitarian aid. And there were big groups of organizations that came together and agreed together on standards and principles and ways to approach humanitarian response to try and improve it. And that was really from learning lessons from when things hadn't worked during the 90s. So I think it was a really interesting example of where people wanted to improve and they came together to do that. So the diagram I've got here represents something that's often called the cluster system. And this is still broadly how the humanitarian system is structured. Though, like I said, it does differ in a number of ways in different countries and contexts. But essentially, the structure is that there's different thematic areas, like food and security. You can see health, logistics, shelter. And different organizations will be the lead for that cluster. But then there's a big effort to be coordinated across. And that's shown by the figure in the center. And then around the outside, you can see that this structure is seen as relevant at kind of throughout the whole cycle of humanitarian response. So we often think about humanitarian response kind of before a disaster occurs, and that can be called preparedness, into when the disaster actually happens, through to responding to the disaster, and then recovering from the disaster, and then kind of everything wider than that. And so this is broadly how things are structured. And then so within that, humanitarian aid can be a lot of different things. I think a lot, the image that we see a lot on the news, and maybe what people think about really quickly when they think about humanitarian aid, is food. And that's still provided in very severe humanitarian crises. Food relief might be provided. But it's also a lot of other things. So provision of sanitation and water, latrines, washing facilities, drinking water, provision of education for children, especially when there's long-term crises, which is what we call protracted crises. And protracted crises are becoming more and more common. Things like shelter, cooking materials and home materials, maybe even programs that support people to get jobs and build their skills. Mental health support. We know there's obviously a lot of trauma experienced during humanitarian response. And then recently has been a big move towards providing cash support and vouchers for people who've been affected by crises. Now, international humanitarian aid kind of racks up huge sums of money every year and requires a lot of money to respond to. So in 2019, the humanitarian aid figure internationally was about $28 billion. But the reality is that this only makes up a relatively small proportion of all the support that's given during a crisis. And so this next diagram, I think, illustrates that. So it says that humanitarian assistance internationally is the kind of tip of the iceberg, but under the water and maybe not so formalized and so obvious are loads of other forms of support, whether that's within and between communities, from faith-based organizations, from international remittances, from governments supporting their own people, different forms of financing, sometimes even the private sector now. So I think it's just worth remembering that there's a bigger picture to humanitarian response as well. So then, I work at the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, and so I thought it was probably right that I tell you a bit about what humanitarian innovation is. So we use a definition that we created with an organisation called LNAP, and that definition is an iterative process that identifies, adjusts, and diffuses ideas for improving humanitarian action. And we've got this schematic here that illustrates that we see it as a kind of process of innovation, starting from one end where you have a recognition of a problem. You think there's something that maybe isn't working and you need to explore it more. You need to understand it from diverse perspectives of people and look at it in different angles, through to searching for existing solutions, through to adapting and inventing new or kind of amended solutions. And then when you come up with a solution, you might wish to pilot it, where you're going to learn a lot from it, be really iterative. And then if it's working and you think you've got a good solution, you might then try to scale it. You might try and have more people use it, drive uptake of it and increase its impact. And it all looks really, really beautiful and simple in a diagram like this. In reality, you've got lines going everywhere, you've got squiggles everywhere, it's back and forth, things don't work, you go back to the drawing board, you try something again. Things work in one place, but they don't work somewhere else, so you go back to the drawing board, and it's a really kind of complicated process. But this is how it looks in its most simplest form. And so then just along the bottom, I've just included a few kind of keywords that I think represent humanitarian innovation and are important for innovation. So the first is uncertainty. When you're trying something new or you're adapting something to a new context, you have to recognize there's going to be uncertainty. There's going to be things you know, things you don't know, and things you don't even know you don't know. And that means you have to be comfortable with that uncertainty. But it also means that you have to have processes in place that you can constantly be learning and checking that things are going okay. So that leads me to the second one about learning. You really need to have a kind of monitoring system in place, if you like, so that you can even know if your innovation is improving humanitarian response or not. And so the next word is improvement. If your innovation isn't trying to kind of improve outcomes for people affected by crises, isn't leaning towards improvement, then is it really worth pursuing? It needs to be either making something more efficient, helping people, supporting something to happen, etc., etc. And then the last one is really important, and that's the concept of ethics. And it's really linked to uncertainty as well. So people affected by humanitarian crises can be some of the most vulnerable people in the world at the moment, depending on who they are, depending on what they've experienced. And there can be a lot of different risks, a multitude of risks in a humanitarian setting. So it's really important that ethics is really upfront when you're innovating in such a context, and you're really aware of what the risks might be and how you're going to mitigate against those risks. So really quickly, I'll just highlight one or two of these. These are examples of what we've supported at the HIF. So things like 3D printing of humanitarian supplies. That's trying to make the normal situation is you have kind of big international shipping of supplies to a humanitarian response. But with 3D printing technology becoming more viable, now we can manufacture products in situ in a response, which is obviously quicker and more effective and more sustainable. And then another example would be mobile labs to treat fecal sludge. So when you've got lots of people in one place, just like you would for a big humanitarian response or a big refugee camp, you need to manage fecal sludge. And for that, you need to do lots of testing and check safety and learn how to dispose about it, just how to dispose it. So mobile labs are a really great way to ship that capability into the location, rather than having to rely on sending samples far away for testing and things like that. There's other few examples there, and feel free to pick them out for questions later. And then these are just some pictures that represent kind of my job. So facilitating innovation teams at workshops. This was in January in Amsterdam. Running consultations with people who have experienced humanitarian crises and hearing their priorities. If they have specific needs. In this case, we were trying to learn if older people and people with disabilities had experienced barriers to response in Indonesia, and they gave us and shared with us their priorities and their experiences. Really quickly then, 3 takeaways from, I guess, my career path today and my current job. Something that I find really rewarding is helping others to find the answers. I'm not really an expert in any one thing, but I have learned how to help others come up with really good ideas and to innovate, and I really enjoy doing that. The second one is that inclusion is everyone's responsibility. I know that Funding True North has actually had a diversity and inclusion advisor speak on the series before, and I really enjoyed hearing her messages around this as well. Yeah, inclusion isn't just a responsibility of a specialist disability charity, for example. it's up to all of us to make small adjustments to what we do to make sure that no one's excluded every day. And then lastly, a really important one for me is to always remember, in my case, the people that I ultimately am doing my job for are people who are affected by crises, but it doesn't mean that they are passive recipients of innovation. They themselves are resilient, they are innovative, and they are the experts in their own lives and needs. And that's what you always have to remember, especially if you're working in an international sector where you're often living far away from where the action is happening. Thank you. Those are my 3 takeaways. And I'm going to hand back over to Ryan and Olivia now.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for going through all of that information. Just as a bit of a reminder to ask questions, you can do it in 2 ways. One, through the comments section, or the other way through slido.com using the code FTN. So to kick off things, I have 2 things. One's a statement and one's a question. So you spoke about perfection early on, and it really made me think of this quote, which I love, which is strive for excellence, not perfection.
Nice.
And I guess when it comes to humanitarian relief, like, it is so time critical that actually getting a solution or some aid out there in the quickest way possible is, more important in some cases than getting, the perfect solution out there. So that was more of a statement and just a thought that ran through my head. But a question is, you spoke about some of the technology that you're using when it comes to things like 3D printing. And then even when you spoke about innovation processes, I think of things like design thinking, which is used in industry. Are there any other technologies that you use, or any frameworks which you think are actually, interesting to both humanitarian relief, but equally anyone who's in a business?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's actually something that we ourselves are always learning from our innovators, because they come from a really diverse range of backgrounds. Some of them are design thinkers, some of them are technologists, some of them are researchers, and some of them are, people affected by crises themselves. Design thinking, I think, is an absolutely huge resource and probably the most important, and it's so broad as well. There's so many things that come under design thinking. Other kind of maybe like slightly on the same page as that would be learning from like participatory research, particularly in my case, learning from research that's not only participatory but really inclusive. So how are you adapting your approach to learning from people? How are you making it accessible for someone with a hearing impairment, someone with a visual impairment, someone with an intellectual disability? And it really means that you yourself have to innovate in what you're doing, because you have to make sure that you have things available in a wide range of formats. Maybe it's audio, maybe it's visual, maybe it's pictorial based rather than written. So I think we have a lot to learn from people who for a long time have been really accessible. I think often people talk about how accessible features in our technology actually improve things for a lot of people. People often give the example of like Siri on your iPhone, which was initially a kind of concept of an accessibility feature, but everyone uses Siri and it works. I mean, I don't, but a lot of people do. So I think we're just always interested in learning from different sectors.
Oh, wow.
I love using Siri as well. If I'm driving and I'm like navigating somewhere, obviously you don't want to be on the phone. When you want to tell it to stop, I've got used to like saying, like, Siri, oh, my phone's gonna go off. No, okay. When you say it, there's lots of people's names who sound very similar to Siri, and then my phone buzzes. I'm telling it to like stop my navigation if I've got to where I need to be, or I know my route now. Anyway, Olivia, enough about me and my driving.
And your virtual personal assistant.
That's what it is.
No, Sophie, thanks for sharing your story on this project that we started with Fighting True North. Something that I've noted is that you really thrive with variety, and I think having a job or a position that was, I guess, quite monotone in some respect and maybe too focused in theory or subject, but actually wouldn't allow you to flourish as well as you are capable of? Because it sounds like even from A levels with your variety of topics, through even with environmental science, there were so many different ways that you could use your brain and to really apply yourself. And I just think that where you are now, or what you choose to do elsewhere, is really, I think you're a real benefit, because you do thrive under having, I guess, knowing so many different disciplines and being able to use them in new ways. And I have a question regarding how you got to your current job. When you spoke about how there were many interviews that you had, of course, there were probably different industries, different sectors, but you spoke about how you had many rejections. And I was wondering how you were able to still keep going without being too disheartened. What kind of self-talk did you give yourself in order to keep going to the next interview, but also reminding yourself that you were still good enough and you just had not found your place?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I think like natural optimism probably gets you some of the way. And yeah, definitely did for me. I think also I was pretty good, and I think a lot of us as humans, we are quite good at like creating reason, you know, thinking maybe that didn't work for a good reason, that one door closes, another door opens type thinking. And I think then kind of later on, you kind of reap the benefits a bit later on, actually. So I'm really glad you brought it up, because then when I was at DFID and I was looking for another job, I actually got offered some jobs that I went for interviews at, and I then turned them down after the interview. And I think it's the interviews for me just didn't inspire me. And I actually thought, okay, I mean, maybe I could do okay in this job, but having been to this interview, I now know it's not for me. And I think a lot of employers forget that interviews aren't just for the employer, they're for the person that's applying for the job. So a really great message on Twitter the other day, and I can't remember who said it, so I'm sorry to not give credit to this person. But they basically said that when an interviewer says to you, why do you want this job? It's a really unfair question, because it's, you know, they can't answer, they shouldn't have to answer that before having the interview. It should instead be kind of, what qualities do you have, and like, why is this job of interest to you? And so yeah, I think it's really good to try and remember that interviews are not just for the employer, they're for you. Ask really good questions, listen and watch the dynamics between people and see if it's somewhere you'll fit in. And then yeah, I think if you're getting rejection, it's kind of just like keep your head down. In my case, you know, don't be afraid to work in a call center or work anywhere temporarily, to keep yourself busy, to keep yourself earning money while you can. Yeah.
I was on mute.
On mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. I think that's really good advice, because of course, rejection is all about perspective. Rejection is just redirection into somewhere else, and you kind of choose where you want to go depending upon what you learned from that experience, and makes you change your priorities, or maybe think what your priorities are. I think that's really great advice. And I've had similar advice about the interview process, is that it's an opportunity whereby they can interview you to see if you are a good fit for the job, but also you have to take that time at the end to interview the employer to see if they're a good fit for you, not just who you are now, but who you plan to be 2 to 3 years down the line. So I think that's great advice.
We've had a question come in, which is actually a similar one that I had. So what would you consider as the most inspiring innovation to facilitate inclusion of people with disabilities in humanitarian aid? Oh,
that is such a brilliant question. And I could talk with that person about that for a whole day, I think. Really fitting as well, because Ryan and Olivia know that today HIF launched 2 challenges looking at inclusion of people with disabilities and older people. So when we launch an innovation challenge, we open a window, it's competitive, people look at the kind of the theme of the innovation challenge and make an application, and then we review them and select the best projects, basically. So it's a really exciting day today for me to launch it. And the reason that's relevant to this question is because sadly, there's not one thing. As with a lot of complex issues, inclusion of people with disabilities and older people means tackling a lot of different barriers. And some of them are things that you might think about quite readily, like physical barriers, there being only stairs and no accessible entrance, or there not being kind of physically accessible places to go. But actually some of the most difficult barriers are ones that are societal or institutional, and people's perceptions around people with disabilities or older people that need challenging. So I think where I'm really interested to see how these innovation challenges go are going to be the innovations that successfully tackle multiple barriers. So they might provide us with something, an idea that helps overcome physical barriers to accessibility and inclusion. But at the same time, they might come up with interesting ways to train humanitarian staff or interesting community-based activities that help reduce stigma and reduce prejudice around disability and older age. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't give you one kind of specific innovation, but I think that wouldn't be truthful to say that one exists. We're going to have to tackle a lot of different barriers to inclusion to really see progress in inclusion.
Do you know, it's really interesting because it reminds me of something off topic but related in a way, of how technology can be used in lots of different ways to tackle problems. So there was a game called, I want to say it's called Sequest, and it was all about how do you get more research to help solve for dementia. So what it is an app where you play this game for like a couple minutes a day, and while you're playing it, it's pulling all this data to understand how does the brain work when it comes to navigation, because apparently that's one of the first things to go with dementia. So it was just really interesting that you're playing something really fun, but actually it's helping research into dementia and how to prevent it. So for some reason, it just sprung to my mind when you said that, because it's looking at things in a slightly different way, which you wouldn't have typically thought about.
Yeah, I think that's an example to me of like tackling the big picture and tackling the small picture at the same time, which is definitely what's needed if you actually want to create change. Yeah.
Have you got any other questions from the audience?
Just give me a second. I'll let you ask one.
Okay. Okay, sure. No, to touch upon that comment, it's very clear that especially with humanitarian innovation, it's really important for the technology to be sustainable in the sense that it can be multi-purpose, it can be multi-use, it can be used for a long time, it can be the gift that keeps on giving in some respects. And I think with inclusion is really important in that, because if technology doesn't have an inclusive attitude, then it will only be useful for one demographic. And so I think it's really applaudable what the project that you've launched today, because it will help technology to become more inclusive. And Ryan, touching upon your point, that's one of the beauty of gamification of technology, is that you can have fun, you can be playing, but you could be doing something fundamental to what the essence of the technology is about. And with Sophie, your talk especially, it is very high pressure. And I can imagine that, especially when you first started, there was maybe a very steep learning curve, not just because of all the amount of information that you have to learn, but it seems to me that humanitarian innovation is a very diagnostic process. You have to be very meticulous in what you suggest. You have to do lots of research beforehand. And I was wondering, how did you get better at that skill? Being able to diagnose what thing to apply, but also the efficiency and how to get to the solution fast.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So I think, first of all, credit where credit's due. When I joined, I think the HIF had done a lot of learning itself and realised that we needed to focus on the problem even more, and had really decided to kind of balance our approach, that we were focusing as much on the problem, if not more on the problem, before thinking about solutions. And so I think I joined and learned a lot from my colleagues who had already learned that lesson, and they were really generous with their wisdom on that. But I think then the reason we changed to do that is because we listened to other people, and people who were working in humanitarian response, people who were affected by crises themselves, were seeing, like you said, this unsustainable approach to innovation, where a lot of new things were being tried and then kind of dying off and not really being taken up. And often that was because they hadn't done their diagnostics. They hadn't looked at the problem enough. So what that means in practice is that the challenges that launched today, behind the scenes has been work going on for a long time. Lots and lots of research, lots of consultation, talking to people, lots of reviewing things that have already been done to see what the gaps are. And so I think it's having the confidence to kind of take your foot off the pedal a bit and think, I'm not going to push forward with saying this is the solution right now. Instead, I'm going to be humble and I'm going to say there's a lot of unknowns and there's things we need to know first. And I think sometimes there is pressure to fund solutions, but they're not going to work. And in fact, in worst case scenario, they could do more harm than good if you don't really understand the problem. So I hope I answered your question.
Oh yeah, certainly. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. It almost reminds me a little bit of agile ways of, I guess, a solving, like approaching a problem, which is really interesting. Ryan, what do you think?
It really makes me think about how in innovation, talking broadly, not every idea needs to go into production. Like some should fail because you learn a lot from failing. So yeah, I have two questions. So one of them, partly to blame because I mentioned apps and gamification and things like that. So any interesting low resource technological innovations that you've come across? Because as we're talking about apps, which is what I mentioned, not everyone has access to phones or internet. What are some of the technological innovations that are kind of low tech that you've seen or you've heard of work quite effectively in certain cases?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that I think we are quite rightly cautious about technology, about conflating innovation with technology, because innovation doesn't, for us at least, it doesn't just mean technology. So if there is a purely technological solution offered, we're often quite hesitant about that, and we want to understand a bit more why technology would be the answer in a given situation. But nevertheless, there are examples of good low-tech technology-based innovation for sure. Some of that is as simple as product design. So going back to, in a humanitarian response, you need something that is both durable, easy to make, safe, and cheap. And one of the things that UNICEF has been piloting is like a rapid prototype of an accessible attachment to a latrine, so that an older person or a person with a mobility-related disability or even a pregnant woman can use that latrine safely and have a kind of aid to help them sit down and can sit comfortably and things like that. It sounds really simple, or it doesn't even sound like it's innovation, but it is, because it's so low tech. It's just looking at, what's a good plastic mold to build something from, and how can we deploy that and get people using it. So that, if you like, is to me like the most that's a kind of like a fixed technology. At the other end, I think one of the examples I gave on one of my slides, but I didn't get a chance to talk through it because I talk too much, is an approach that we worked with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and with Save the Children. And they piloted a technology-based method for user-centered sanitation. And they engaged with community members, with lots of different community members, children, older people, women, men, people with disabilities, and using a tablet, they showed an image of different sanitation facilities. And then they encouraged the people, the users, to interact with that image and show what places were, what features they liked, what features they didn't like, where things didn't work for them, issues they'd had. And some of the things that came up were, really seemingly obvious. The fact that steps were too high for some people to access, or the things like having the lock on the door wasn't a good enough lock, or it got stuck, so people didn't want to use it. And using that tablet feature rather than, I suppose, like an analog piece of paper, meant that the research team could talk to a lot of people and then aggregate that data and see hotspots of what people were saying across the board wasn't working for them, and then make changes to their sanitation provision based on what people were actually saying. So yeah, to me, that's how, in this case, it was a tablet-based user design approach, worked really well.
That's super interesting, just to see how you can have really low tech or no tech innovations, and then also how technology in a way can help facilitate scaling ideas in terms of getting feedback, as you said, using the tablet instead of analog. Another question, and I like this one because a lot of businesses now are talking about sustainability, their environment, the part they play in it. I know people where I'm at, where their role is as a sustainability expert, looking at how do we become more carbon neutral, etc. What do you think the role of kind of businesses play in the space of humanitarianism, sustainability, looking after the environment, things like that?
Yeah, so I think the role of the private sector and businesses in the humanitarian sector is one that's really, really interesting and kind of constantly evolving. And part of the reason that it's interesting is because private sector involvement is increasing. And one reason for that is because humanitarian need is increasing. You know, with the effects of climate change making more severe storms, or with, like I said, more protracted crises that are lasting longer, people are displaced for a long time from their homes. The international aid community hasn't been able to meet the need that needs to be kind of addressed. So private sector has, I think, started to make some steps to see how they can be involved. And one of the ways is through technology. So when I was at DFID, I was working with an organisation called the GSMA.
I think that's Sophie's end going, because I can still see Olivia moving. It's not mine.
We are having.
Oh, I think you're back.
What was the last thing you heard?
Using technology, and then it started to go a little bit fuzzy.
Did I mention the GSMA?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think they're like the GSMA, some of the GSMA's biggest partners are big telecom providers. You know, like in the UK, we have Vodafone and O2, etc. And obviously they operate all over the world in all different countries. And there's definitely a role that can be explored for example, for a telecom provider to say, well, how can you help refugees, for example, with connectivity so that they can stay connected to family, they can connect and find out information they need, they can access services even online. So I think when there's like a really clear problem and there's something really clear that the private sector could offer, then there's definitely ways that could be beneficial for a lot of people. Whether they have a responsibility, to me, it's just so contextual. If there's not a really big need, if there's not a really clear need and a clear problem defined, I think, yeah, it's another thing I think where we rightfully need to be a little bit cautious. But yeah.
Ooh.
Sorry that you lost me.
That's okay. These things happen. We've had a few technical issues, which I think can probably be made into like a compilation of bloopers. So do not worry. It's all fine. Ryan, the poll. What have people been saying?
Ooh,
so
yeah,
the question was, what do you think is the main cause of humanitarian crisis around the world? And we've got a 50-50 split of natural hazard related disasters, e.g. earthquakes and hurricanes, etc. And the other popular answer was other or combination. So the other combination would include things like droughts, famine, conflict and violence. Sophie, from your point of view, are there any statistics on what is the main cause?
Yeah, there are some, and I hope this isn't too dissatisfying, because it's somewhat of a trick question, because it's very, very complicated, because often there's compounding things happening. It's not as simple as one or the other. But actually, the UN every year, the United Nations, produces a global humanitarian overview for each year. It gives really interesting statistics and also highlights trends in the sector. And one of the big trends is that conflict is the biggest driver of humanitarian crises now, and it's been a growing trend. Even though in terms of numbers, more people are affected by natural hazard-driven disasters, the people that are then experiencing humanitarian crises comes more from conflict. But then, like I said, with climate change, things are becoming much more interlinked, much more complex. So yeah, it's a tiny bit of a trick question, because often it is a combination and it's always changing.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you tested the audience with that trick question. because you learn so much with trick questions, like little puzzles. They're great. I have a question. So of course we cannot avoid the situation that we're in. We are in a international pandemic,
Yes.
and I'm sure everybody knows. And with your industry, of course, it's impossible to be everywhere at once. And ideally, you would be, in the field and the ground at the place of a crisis to help deploy solutions. And of course, there's many people who cannot be there because they need to either do research, they need to be with the company, they need to do more orchestration. But with the pandemic, how compatible is humanitarian innovation in still delivering that high level of help and high level of service? Is your industry compatible with remote working, so to speak, or even just how we've had to adapt in these times?
Yeah, gosh, I don't know if I'm fully qualified to really speak on this subject, because I think maybe like every other sector, the humanitarian sector is still working out, how best it can adapt to this new context we're in, where social distancing is imperative and when you can't travel as freely. So every week there's multiple webinars and reports and all sorts of things coming out. But essentially, I think the fundamentals of innovation, which mean adapting, pivoting, adjusting, and rapidly learning, are what's needed right now, and what a lot of people and a lot of the humanitarian community are actually doing, and probably not labeling it as innovation, but actually they are being innovative by thinking, okay, I can't reach out to those people through a community-based workshop anymore. I'm going to have to set up a WhatsApp group and make sure everybody has credit on their phones if they have phones. Or the other big trend is that people who are based in the regions affected by crises and are based in those countries are being more empowered to do more of the work, which is something that needs to happen anyway, rather than being internationally led. So it could be a bit of an accelerator, so that more people who are based in regions affected by crises are going to be the ones that are doing the work. But like every sector, like every industry around the world, I think it's going to create really big changes, and there's still a lot of uncertainties.
Great. I think that was a really well-rounded, thoughtful response, even though it was very hard. So thank you very much. Ryan, have you got any other questions?
I'm conscious of time, so we will take some of these questions offline, which leads in quite well to what you might say now.
I have one more question. Can I ask one quickly?
Depends how quick it is. Go.
Okay. I'll be very, very succinct. So in this time, it's caused companies to think about what's important to them and how they've learned about themselves or how other people work. You used to travel a lot for work for this job, but of course you've had to stay at home. I wanted to ask, what have you learned about yourself whilst being in lockdown and having to work from home?
What have I learned about myself? that I still have to get dressed every day. I know some people work in pajamas. I cannot do that. It doesn't work for me. Psychologically, it doesn't do it for me. But yeah, more broadly, I think it's one of my values was about space and about having time to rest and recover and relax and socialize and live your life. And I think yes, being one of the privileged people who has been able to work from home, I definitely be able to put that into practice a little bit more. Yeah.
Great. I have now finished my question, and thank you, Sophie, for answering that question. Quick fire question, put you on the spot. Thank you. I think we can go into the next slide.
Okay. Go back to the presentation.
Fantastic. So this has been a lecture style episode in a really great way, because of course we get to find out about Sophie's journey, her mindset, and how she rooted through A-levels to university to all the different roles that led her to her current job, which shows that not only is variety, what is that phrase? Variety is the spice of life. Yeah, variety is the spice of life. However, in addition to that, variety can be very beneficial because you gain clarity in what you like, what you do not like, what you want, and maybe what's not relevant anymore. So Sophie, thank you so much for sharing your journey. And if you would like to learn much more about Sophie, we're going to have final few questions that are going to be asked off air. And you can also have the slides to keep in a PDF that we call an episode highlight document. That's going to be released on Friday, the 10th of July. And next week, we have another guest at the same time, and Ryan's going to explain who that person is. So Ryan, who have you got?
Yes, so Gopi is joining us next week, and he works for Barclays. I have actually worked in the same team as him. He is an amazing guy, always happy, always got a positive mindset. But the reason why we wanted him to join the series is because he has a really personal story that's shaped kind of his life. And it really is a great example of how getting into, say, a graduate scheme for him wasn't just a job. It could actually change his life and his family's life. So I'm so excited next week to be joined by Gopi. So please tune in. And thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us today. I've learned a lot personally, so I've got something out of it.
Thank you. Yeah, your questions, everyone's questions were great, so thank you.
Cool. And see you next week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.